Introduce Tyler Hinton from Convoso, and he is going to kick off our conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, again, welcome to our roundtable discussion, Flag, Block, Stirred, and Shaken. So we've really been looking forward to this one. I've got a variety of people here with me as well. So we have Nima Hakimi. He is our CEO and co-founder at Convoso. So Nima, thank you for joining us. We also have Josh Stevens. He's a partner at Mac Murray Shuster, and he is a guru about all things related to outbound call center compliance. So we're super excited to have him as well. And then we have Gabe Bletnitsky from CallTrader. He's their CEO and co-founder. He's one of our customers, and so we always love listening to his insights as well. And my name is Tyler Hinton. I'm our product marketing director at Convoso. But let's go ahead and get started here. And I think when we talk about call flagging and blocking and the state of what's going on with this topic, it's always interesting to look at the numbers and see how many robocalls are being placed within the United States every year. And this started to become a problem, pre-2016, but every year we've seen a pretty substantial increase in the number of robocalls being placed in the United States. The exception being 2020, we think COVID kind of took a bite out of that, but we're expecting to see quite a bit in 2021. We're expecting to see some growth over that 46 billion. So the issue is, though, roughly half of these are fraudulent. And so that's why you're seeing carriers getting, they're taking a lot more time to try and flag and block different numbers that are out there. You're seeing action on the government level, both federal and state level. And so that's kind of just the state of where we're at as an industry. There's a lot of robocalls being placed, and there's a lot of activity to try and stay ahead of this issue. And so this is having a pretty big impact on the legitimate businesses as well. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to start with. Maybe Nima, you could give us just a quick overview of what you've seen out there. How big of an impact is this having on our customers?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously a really, really big deal. Everybody's dealing with it. You have, unfortunately, the bad actors that decide to just call anyone and everyone, calling with what's referred to as voice broadcasting, pre-recorded messages, which makes it unfortunately has made it easy, given how technology has advanced over the years and how relatively inexpensive it has become to do robocalling, where you're just blasting away millions of people. And so it's caused every one of the legitimate businesses that are doing things the right way a lot of stress and made business more difficult, more challenging. You're now having to deal with problems that didn't exist before. For you to just run your business successfully, you get roadblocks where you just don't have the right anymore to operate your business even though you might be doing it in a compliant manner. It's just gotten out of control. And so it got to the point where obviously the FCC is putting pressure and applying pressure on the carriers, and the carriers are not taking matters into their own hands. I mean, we'll talk more about it, but it's definitely the number one challenge for any outbound call center today, to be able to get in touch with their customers when they have asked for them to reach out to them and they've given them consent. And now it's not a matter of, will I get that call if I ask for it, but maybe I will or maybe I won't, depending on how you approach it.
Yeah, and I think one of the more interesting things that I've noticed too is just the amount of pressure that's being placed on carriers to try and fix the issue of those illegal robocalls being placed. And there's actually an article out there from AT&T where they're specifically talking about how they're blocking almost double the amount of calls that they did in previous years. And so I think we're definitely seeing this quite a bit out in the market. And I think a lot of this stems from the Trace Act that came out in 2019 and some of the safe harbor provisions that prevent carriers from being held liable. And so, Josh, I was wondering if you could give us just a quick overview of what that is and why that has such a big impact.
Yeah, and I think it's important to separate blocking and labeling. We often conflate those in connection with this issue because we know that the impact to business can be essentially the same. If a call is labeled as potential scam or telemarketer or something like that, consumers aren't going to answer it. It's effectively blocked. But the FCC and the way that the law works, those are kind of two separate issues. And what the FCC has said with regards to labeling, for example, is, we don't care. Carriers can do what they want because the call goes through, and the consumer can get a voicemail. They can look up the number through reverse, look up somehow and call the number back. The call connects. So the FCC doesn't really worry about labeling. Whereas with blocking, there is essentially a set of protections under the Communications Act from the 30s that calls are supposed to connect. And there are only certain instances where a carrier is allowed to censor a call, shall we say. And one of those is with the Trace Act, and when a carrier has implemented blocking based on reasonable analytics. The FCC has essentially given carriers broad discretion to apply their analytics frameworks and determine when they think a call is likely illegal, so long as they have a redress mechanism and a way for the caller to come back and say, I don't think you should have blocked this call. But that's retroactive, right? That's going after the injury has already occurred and trying to stop it from occurring again in the future. So it's much more important, and I know we'll talk about this later, to try to come up with strategies to reduce the blocking on the front end, and to also, hopefully reduce the labeling as well.
Absolutely. And so what the Trace Act was in 2019, it was passed, right? And almost unanimously. And so one of the things that we noticed at Convoso was just an impact of things like contact rates, just in general. As after that law was passed, it just kind of progressively got a little bit worse. And so, Nima, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. What have you seen over the past couple of years in terms of just the impact of how things are going now versus prior to 2019, before the Trace Act was in place?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest impact is definitely the call flagging. It used to be that your calls would go through. There was no, hey, why is my contact rate all of a sudden, going down, and what's going on? You had the ability to manage that, and there were other reasons maybe why your contact rate would go down. But as these analytics companies started to implement this technology and work with the carriers, you started seeing things where there's no rhyme or reason, where literally, like, the caller IDs for one reason or another started getting flagged, and your contact rate instantly goes down. Nobody wants to pick up the phone if you see spam, right? And so from our perspective, what we're seeing as we're monitoring this on our end is, some customers just randomly see their call IDs being flagged, others don't, regardless of what volume you're doing. But because of all these different reasons, that the apps, the consumer's ability to do these things, there are many different reasons now why this happens. But the call flagging one and seeing that happen has had the biggest impact. And again, it's very unfortunate. You have a legitimate business that's not doing things the wrong way, that's following the law, making calls, but it's death to a business if your consumer is not picking up the phone. And a lot of our customers buy high intent, good quality leads where the person is filling out a form at that moment and they want a call. And so what we're seeing is customers calling us and saying, hey, why aren't my calls going through? And it's definitely had an impact on how things are operated, and we'll talk more about kind of what to do about it. But it's definitely an industry-wide problem, and it's unfortunate that we are where we are here today.
Gabe, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this too. How has the call flagging and blocking impacted your business?
Oh, it's impacted our business quite a bit, actually. But I think it's first important to call out that there's a distinction between legitimate calls where a consumer has provided express consent and we're outbound dialing that person because they want to hear from us, versus the fraudulent calls where someone might be blasting pre-recorded messages to millions of people all at the same time. So it affects our business quite a bit. So I would say at the beginning of 2021, we started to see our contact rate plummet. We weren't quite sure why. We weren't completely aware of the landscape and what was happening behind the scenes with the carriers. And we quickly realized that we needed a mechanism to better understand which calls are getting through, if they're getting through, if they're not getting through. And so we pretty much scrambled this year to kind of figure out what our technology stack would look like, what type of platforms we would use, and how we can better get a handle on what causes our contact rate to go down, and then find ways to mitigate that through levers that might be at our disposal. But it's absolutely impacted our business. Last year, going from being extremely profitable on our lead spend to Q1 being negative because the majority of our leads were not even being contacted. These are people who raised their hands, wanted a phone call from us, but through a mechanism that was outside of our control, we couldn't get to them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I go back to that article I mentioned for that AT&T release saying, yeah, we're blocking double the amount of calls than we were versus 2020, and they're claiming, yeah, we very rarely flag numbers in error. And I think us in the industry, we kind of look at that and we say, wow, I don't know about that. This is having a really big impact on our businesses. And so, Josh, what's going on the legislation front here? Is there any litigation, anything like that might help alleviate this issue for businesses, legitimate actors out there?
Well, as I mentioned, Tyler, there is a requirement to have a redress mechanism. We saw recently that US Telecom published their best practices, an updated version of their best practices for providing redress. But again, that's trying to correct an issue that's already happened. And, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the pressure being put on the carriers to block and flag. There was a letter that went out, I believe it was last Thursday, from the FCC to a few originating carriers who got on the FCC's radar through the Industry Traceback Group, which is the official traceback consortium for the FCC. And they were passing through traffic, they were originating traffic onto the network that was illegal, or at least strongly believed to be illegal. And the FCC told them they had 48 hours to stop that traffic and 14 days to put together a plan to prevent that traffic from coming in the future, or else the FCC was going to tell all terminating carriers and intermediate carriers that they could stop carrying any traffic from those originating carriers. So think about the pressure, right, that puts on an originating carrier to be very proactive, maybe sometimes to an over-eager degree to block or flag calls. And one other thing, Tyler, just came in my mind when you said that AT&T mentioned that they had a very low rate of erroneous blocking or flagging. It's all in how you define it. One of the things we have seen is that carriers with their programs will argue that they were properly labeling a call if they labeled it as debt collection or telemarketing or something like that, that it was an accurate label, even if the net effect of that label is that the person doesn't answer. And so that's something to keep in mind as well when we're talking about accuracy. It's often in how you measure it.
Absolutely. So why don't we shift gears here, though? I think we've talked about how big of an issue this is, but there's also a lot that can be done as a legitimate business to try and stay ahead of this. And so this is something that we focus a lot on here at Convoso. And one of the things that we've noticed is just it's really important to spread out your dialing. Like if you're dialing into an area code, you need to make sure you have the right number of phone numbers to call into that area code. So Nima, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why that's important and what kind of an impact that might have.
Yeah, no, great point. So look, like these strategies, there's a lot of different things you have to do, right? And one won't necessarily just solve the problem, but given where we are today, unfortunately, you kind of got to work with what you have, meaning using the same caller ID to call thousands and thousands of people doesn't work that well. It can, depending on what you do, but what we recommend is you really look at your call volume. And, with Convoso, we make a recommendation on the number of DIDs or caller IDs you should use. So it limits and spreads that load between them, so that you're not making calls with a very few set of numbers, and therefore you may not get flagged. It doesn't mean you won't, but you need to be a little bit more responsible around that. As far as number of DIDs to use, you want to definitely monitor it on a regular basis as your call volume goes up. So, having a monitoring page in place that shows that to you so that you can manage that on a regular basis, on a consistent basis. So it tells you how many numbers you need to spread the load. We recommend something like 50 calls per day per DID. And again, you shouldn't have to do this, right? Like if you have the right to call someone, why do you have to do this in the first place? It's kind of frustrating that we're here, but it kind of is what it is. You need to limit that load, just manage that call volume per number per day, so it doesn't get a lower likely chance that you're going to get flagged.
And I think one of the things that's frustrating too is that each carrier has their own algorithm that determines which numbers are we going to flag. And so, it's almost impossible to try and keep up with those. But one thing you can know for sure is that those algorithms are looking for patterns. So when we like to say dial smarter, not harder. So for example, if you have a dialing cadence where you're redialing leads that don't pick up every 2 hours, that creates a pattern. And those are the kinds of things that the carriers are going to pick up on. So you can use, one way to try and stay ahead of this is be smart about those cadences. Maybe follow up with a lead after 2 hours and for the second attempt, and then maybe spread it out to 4 hours for the third attempt, for example. So there's things like that you can do to try and stay ahead of this. But of course, it's certainly a big challenge out there. So Gabe, I'm curious to hear your perspective too, just as one of our customers. What have been some of the best practices that have really helped your business stay ahead of this?
Well, the challenge is that there haven't been any industry-wide best practices. So we've really had to figure it out for ourselves, and we've had to create our own set of best practices. Truthfully, those best practices are ever evolving. And as the landscape continues to change, we're learning more and more about what we can do to mitigate some of these, call it self-policing actions of the carriers. So, we're doing things like arresting DIDs that are flagged. We're finding that if you arrest them, a certain percentage of them will become unflagged. We also swap out DIDs. So a certain percentage of our DIDs that get blocked, we swap them out. Obviously, as you dial at scale, you're going to have more and more DIDs that get flogged or blocked. So swapping out all of them might not be cost effective. So it's finding that balance between some of the mitigating factors and cost, because obviously DIDs are expensive. The more you have, the more they cost, the more you swap them out, the more you pay. So it's just finding that balancing act. One of the other things that we do is pay very close attention to contact rate by lead cohort or data source. Not every source is created equal. Every source has a different price based on its value. We're starting to look at contact rate by lead source as well as a metric for determining how we treat each list, how we rest DIDs within a list of DIDs for a particular lead source. So again, it's an ongoing effort, and we're kind of figuring it out as we go.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it varies by customer. And I think Nima's got some really good insights on this too. Like, what are some other things that you've seen out there that our customers are doing?
Yeah, so it's true that there's no rhyme or reason sometimes how these calls get flagged or blocked. You do want to do several different things. One, use different sets of DIDs for the different types of lead sources you have. Maybe you have some higher intent versus lower intent don't maybe use the same one. So if you're getting blocked or flagged on one set, it doesn't impact the higher intent or higher quality leads. You definitely want to use an omni-channel approach and make sure it's true omni-channel in the sense that it touches all the channels from besides calling, texting them, right? Maybe sending a text first, letting them know who you are, so when you do call, they know. Incorporating emails into it, and having a system in place that will know when to stop that sequence if there's successful contact made. It doesn't continue to send them a text message if you've already spoken to them. That's very important. You do want to have the ability to monitor them. So we have a monitoring page, and then it shows you if your caller IDs are being flagged by carrier. So you have the ability at least to make that decision of when you want to swap out the number, and then you want to register your phone number. There's Google verified calls where it will show the company that's calling, the reason for the call, and your logo on an Android phone. And then we can help you also register your numbers with the other companies so that it's less likely to get flagged. It doesn't mean it won't still get flagged. That's the frustrating part, even if you register it. But the point here is you need to have that visibility and transparency into what's going on with your caller IDs, so that you can do something about it in a timely manner, which won't impact your contact rates the moment somebody gets flagged. And just be smarter about it. The days of dialing your leads to death and pounding them to death, they're over. You have to be smarter about how you approach your outreach strategy. You have to look at the data, like Gabe said, look at the contact rates by lead source, pay attention to all of the data. The data will tell you what's going on in order to figure out if you need to change your strategy or you need to make some decisions that will get you back on track.
Awesome. I think those are some great points. So last slide here, and then we'll get into the discussion phase of this roundtable. But Nima, can you start us off with just a quick overview of Stir Shaken, what it is, what are the different attestation levels? Why do we need to be focused on this?
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, Stir Shaken, the problem that it's supposed to solve is caller ID spoofing. So being able to put a number for the caller ID that does not belong to you, which is how a lot of the bad actors are hiding, right? They're either putting a number that's disconnected or using someone else's number, which is even worse. It causes problems for the business. One way or another, it's hiding and not showing your true identity of who the caller is. And so where Stir Shaken comes into play is where carriers are now requiring a rating on the call, an A-level rating, B-level rating, or C-level rating that will then determine if the call will go through or not. An A-level rating being that the carrier has confidence in the identity of the caller. They know that the caller has the right to use this caller ID. It belongs to them. So having that A rating will have your call go through. Then B being a partial, attestation. The carrier has confidence in the identity of the caller, but they're not sure if the caller is right to place that call, if they have the right for it. And then C, C-level rating is really obviously the lowest rating, where the carrier cannot certify the identity of the caller or the caller ID. So they may or may not let the call go through. So B or C may not let the call go through. And ultimately, you really want to make sure your voice services provider, wherever the calls are going through, is going to pass an A-level rating to ensure that your calls do not get blocked and actually go through.
And one of the questions I hear a lot is, how big of an impact is Stir Shaken going to have? I think when there was a deadline, I think it was July 1, where all of the large carriers needed to have Stir Shaken in place. And we were getting a lot of questions like, is there going to be this big drop off with calls being flagged and blocked? And that really didn't happen. I think what we've seen so far just in the numbers is there's been about an 8% reduction in the number of robocalls that have been placed since the major carriers got Stir Shaken into place. And there's some isolated cases where they still have some work to do. But yeah, I think part of what is going on right now, and I'm going to give this question to Josh, but I think part of what's going on right now is the carriers are trying to figure out, how do we incorporate Stir Shaken into the algorithms that determine which numbers that we should place a flag on or that we should block? And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, what do you think that process is going to look like, and how much is that going to impact these algorithms?
Yeah. So what we know from having spoken with a number of the analytics providers to the carriers is that Stir Shaken's rating level, A, B, or C, is essentially a data input into the algorithm, just like whether or not the campaign has been registered, or the patterns of the calls, or call length, or any of the other, hundreds of variables that those algorithms are taking into account. And what they have told us is that at least initially here, early in Stir Shaken implementation, that the weight given to that rating in the algorithm is likely to be lower than it will end up being over time. So essentially, they're going to give more weight to that A rating as time progresses and more of the carriers have Stir Shaken fully implemented. I think it's important to remind the audience that while that July 1st deadline was in place, there are a couple pretty significant extensions that are available to smaller carriers and people who have some legacy equipment. So I think I saw a figure recently that was only something like maybe about 20% of carriers have actually fully implemented Stir Shaken across their entire networks. And many more are in a partial implementation phase. So, these analytics engines are not taking this into, as full of account as they probably will in the future. But I do think it's very important, if you can get the A rating, to get the A rating. It's going to give the highest likelihood that the call is going to go through and not be blocked, because it's capable of traceback very easily. And so what fraudster is knowingly going to, I say this and I know people are doing it, but in theory, what fraudster is going to knowingly place a call that can be easily traced back to them? But people do it. So there's a high likelihood that call is going to go through. And there's a reduced likelihood that it's going to be flagged as potential fraud or scam, one of those labels that indicates illegality. Now, that's different from a label that might be spam. There's a big difference between spam and scam, or something like telemarketer, which the carriers have said they feel they're entitled to apply even with an A rating because it describes the call as opposed to the risk associated with the call.
Awesome. Well, I want to open up the floor to everyone who's on the call right now. So feel free to type in questions into the chat, or if you want to come on video and talk with us, we'd love to hear from you. And feel free to ask anything to any of our panelists here. But I think I'll just kick it off here, maybe for Nima or Gabe or anyone on the call. Like, what are some strategies that you've seen be effective with omni-channel to try and stay ahead of this? Like, how can you really take advantage of omni-channel strategies to try to diversify your outreach efforts and maybe limit the impact of the call flagging and the blocking?
Yeah, I would say that, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but definitely texting is something you want to do. You want to get your numbers registered when it comes to texting so that they also go through. But incorporate a combination of text messages in your calls. If you're trying to make calls, limit the number, try maybe 6-7 calls over, let's just say, a week's period of time, but incorporate a few text messages in between. Emails, depending on what your business is doing, may or may not work as well. I would say a combination of text messages, what really works in terms of when you should send it or when you should not send it, and all of that. It really, there's no exact template that says follow it this way. You gotta split test and do some different tests to see what works best for you. However, if you're generating real-time leads where somebody's filling out a form, then definitely I would recommend having that text message sent out immediately upon the form being filled out, so that you can start engaging the consumer that way rather than a call which may or may not go through.
And so another thing that's just been on my mind too, I keep going back to, what's going on in the regulatory environment? How are people trying to make this a better situation for the legitimate actors? So maybe this question can go to Josh or to you, Nima, but what's being done on the advocacy front to try and influence future legislation or just generally try to make this less of an issue for those legitimate actors?
Yeah, go ahead, Josh. No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, and then, obviously, Nima, I know you've got some thoughts on this. From the PACE perspective, because our firm serves as general counsel to PACE, we are constantly getting in front of regulators, filing comments, having meetings, trying to advocate and educate so that regulators understand the real world impact of the decisions that they make. And when notices of proposed rulemaking come out, it's very often that PACE will submit comments or will work with another entity, sometimes like the Chamber of Commerce or something like that, to sign onto a letter or a set of comments that they're filing. For PACE members, I think it's important to be involved in these efforts. An industry association is as strong as its member base. And we, as an organization, work very hard day in, day out on behalf of the membership to get in front of regulators and have their voices heard. But some ways you can help support that effort are, to, of course, be a member, contribute to the PACE Impact Fund when calls go out looking for assistance. Those are funds that we use to help support those advocacy and education efforts. And also when we put out a request for information, which we do sometimes in order to get some data to support comments, it's great for the members to respond to those and give us that data so we can incorporate that into the responses. So I think, those are some great ways that you can really help support those efforts from a PACE perspective. Nima, I turn it to you.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what you said, Josh, Consumer Consent Council, so another association where doing similar things, and we are looking into doing things such as lobbying, and so really just finding out more information about that from both PACE and Consumer Consent. We're really looking to make our voices heard. The legitimate businesses that are doing things the right way, and they're, these businesses are employing a lot of people at the end of the day, right? So it is contributing towards the economy in a positive way. And so for us, it's really making sure our voices are heard. And a big part of it also really self-regulating ourselves, right? Putting in some things in place that are going to show that we are being responsible with our outreach efforts and are taking this seriously. So that's kind of some of the things that we're discussing in terms of how do we set those standards and make sure that they're followed so that it puts us in a good light when we do go towards those efforts of getting potentially into lobbying and advocating on behalf of this industry.
Got a question in the chat here. I think this one's for you, Josh. So can you speak to the issue of how much strategizing on call patterns and rotating out DIDs, things of that nature? At what point does that become too much? Like, is that going to become an issue with the FCC or anything like that? And, at what point do any of those strategies cross the line as too far?
Yeah. So, I think what I'll say to this is there isn't a bright line yet, right? These strategies are being deployed by different businesses in different ways. And so here are a few guardrails I think I would give you. When you're talking about calling pattern and like, for example, calling time, spreading out the calls with different intervals between them, make sure that you're staying within the calling time windows that are permitted under federal and state law for the applicable consumer, and don't barrage the consumer. So when you're setting up that pattern, be sure that you're not, calling them like 10 times a day, because that's what generates complaints. And ultimately, complaints are what get you on the FTC or FCC, or frankly, a state AG's radar. We've seen a lot more state AG action here lately. When it comes to the DIDs, one of the things that I think people forget is the consumer needs to be able to call that number back for a reasonable time period and make a do not call request. So if you use a DID that then say at the end of that night, you put to rest, and when you put it to rest, it can't take an inbound call, that's potentially an issue. So you want to make sure that those numbers are staying open for people to make calls back for at least several days after that outbound call is made. The other thing I would say is there's a difference between a legal risk and a perceptual risk. And if a regulator perceives that you're burning through a lot of DIDs, you're doing a lot of rotating in an effort rather than to make contact to hide who you are, that's going to become an issue. So if you can work to where those calls are getting signed with an A-level attestation, right? So they can be traced back. You're not trying to hide who you are. Those calls can be traced back to you. That helps reduce that risk as well. So it's really about making sure that the consumer can get back to you rather than hiding your identity.
Got another one here. I think I'll give this one to you as well, Josh. So do you know if there's been an increase in blocked calls, and they've got in parentheses 503 busy, since the 9/28 deadline by the FCC for carriers to start blocking unverified calls?
I don't have data on that question. Anecdotally, I've heard that the, I think it's actually maybe 603 cause code has been coming back more frequently rather than just a general busy cause code. But yeah, I don't have data on that.
So we have on our monitoring page, we actually show if a call, through our own ways, we also monitor it as well. I don't have the number specifically. I think it also depends on, again, your calling patterns and the quality of the leads. So there are other variables that will impact that specific number as well.
So this could go to either of you. Is there ever going to be a way for us to know if a call is blocked due to stir shaken versus just any other reason that it would be blocked or flagged?
Well, I mean, other than what we have, I think it's not black or white right now. We have some insights into it. But at this time, not specifically.
Yeah, it's tough because the carrier algorithms are always evolving, right? So, finding a way to track that and monitor that will certainly be a challenge, I think, for us as an industry.
Yeah, however, Tyler, I do think if I'm remembering correctly here, that there's, I believe it's a 603 SIP cause code that has been recommended for use to return back up the line when it's blocked due to a carrier blocking algorithm as opposed to just a normal condition. But that cause code, as I recall, has additional meanings behind it. So it's not entirely clear until there's a dedicated SIP cause code that's specifically, yes, this was blocked because of stir shaken. I think you're always going to have that ambiguity.
Yeah, I think so. So this one I'll give to either Nima or Gabe. Is it helpful to look at contact rates by DID and call attempt as well as by lead source?
I could take that one.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are definitely data points that we look at, and just considering all the different options that we have, at our disposal, those are levers we could pull. So, having really detailed reporting or being able to crunch the numbers on all those variables, I think, is very important. So part of our best practices that we're putting together right now is looking at each of those variables and doing multivariate testing to see what sort of changes on those different levers will improve our contact rate.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would say definitely take a look at it. After how many attempts does the contact rate not increase? I don't know, looking at that is something that not everyone does, but there's a point of diminishing returns where after X number of attempts, you're not going to get that much more. And what you're doing beyond that is just increasing your chances of getting your call ID flagged or calls blocked. So just pay attention to that point of diminishing returns where your contact rate does not go up beyond a certain number of dial attempts.
So here's another good question, and I've got some opinions on this, but I'll let any of you take this as well. So have you seen any signs that regulators or consumers believe that stir shaken is working? Why don't we do this? I'll take on the consumer side, and then I'll kick the regulator side over to you, Josh. So okay. on the consumer side, I think anecdotally, I don't think that they are seeing a huge impact. It's really only been that 8% reduction that we've seen out of, if you look at the number of illegal robocalls are almost 50%, they've probably chopped 8% off of that. So I don't think it's had a big enough impact yet to really make a difference for consumers. But I think as carriers start incorporating this more, like you were talking about earlier, Josh, into their algorithms, that's going to start having a bigger and greater impact for consumers. But go ahead. Go ahead.
On the regulator front, I think it's kind of interesting because I think there were big hopes that stir shaken would have a huge impact right out the gate, but because of the rollout and the various extensions given under the Trace Act and its implementing regulations, it just hasn't gotten fully really implemented yet to the degree I think the regulators were hoping. And they're recognizing that, but they're still hopeful that it's going to work. And the reason I know that is because there were some comments from the FCC, a week or two ago, essentially saying that they want to do a similar thing for text messages. So they want to create, a stir shaken for texting. So that shows that they think this is going to work, but I think they recognize it hasn't had the bang yet that they thought it would.
Josh, keep me honest here, but I thought one of the provisions of the Trace Act was that every 3 years, Congress has to review the latest technology and results of, what that act was trying to address, right? The criminal robocalling. Have you heard anything about any effort maybe in 2022 for Congress to review all of this again?
I've not heard anything, and I know there were some reporting mechanisms on that, but I will admit I don't know those off the top of my head as well as the other provisions. But I think this is something where the FCC and Congress are going to have to keep looking at the interplay of the technology with the goal and make sure that it stays aligned.
All right. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time here, but we got one more question. This is another really good one. So, have any of you heard about carriers incorporating some kind of like a green check mark, for example, for calls that get that A-level attestation for stir shaken?
So yes, because I have 3 of them on my phone right now. I have AT&T. What I'm not sure of is whether it's because of the A or because it's wholly within their network. So we know that AT&T, for example, for a while, when they were first rolling out the green check marker verified, it was for calls that originated within AT&T's network and terminated in AT&T's network. So I don't know if they've expanded it to be all A-level calls that they're giving the check mark to, but that's how it used to work.
All right. Well, why don't we wrap up here? Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I always enjoy these conversations, and we really appreciate all the questions. if you are having issues with call blocking and flagging, this is one of the things that we really focus on at Convoso. So we've helped a wide variety of customers. We have a really awesome solution, or actually a lot of different tools available to help you stay ahead of the issue. So we'd love to chat with you. We've got our phone number, or visit us online. So thank you everyone for joining us here today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.